Good evening, everybody, and welcome to Kuwait Foundation for Advancement of Science for one of our public talk that we hope it will tackle one of the big issues facing the society, whether the current or the future, including the title of our topic today about the climate change, which is the topic that been around for many decades, and we're expecting it to stay with us for another two generations till it's been resolved, hopefully, with a proper and more sustainable solution. I'd like to welcome Mr. Ghassan Khoja, Director of World Bank Office in Kuwait, to say a few welcoming words and introduce our speaker today.
Thank you, Dr. Salim, and thank you for all the attendees. It's really an honor for us to be here in this wonderful institution. I think this is the second of a series of talks that we are collaborating with KFAS. Our appreciation to Dr. Adnan Shahabuddin for the amazing and excellent partnership that has developed between the World Bank Office in Kuwait and and KFAS. It gives me great pleasure to continue this series. We have global experts that come through Kuwait all the time, and it is important that we see the global experience that we have gained and to see if we can transfer that through some of these talks, not only to bring those issues to Kuwait, but also to understand Kuwait's position on some of these global issues. None is more important than the topic for today, which is climate change and climate resilience. I'm pleased that we have today with us Dr. Lia Sieghart. Dr. Lia is a practice manager for environment, natural resource management, and the blue economy for the Middle East and North Africa, for Pakistan and for Afghanistan. So her span of her geographic span is quite wide. But her experience is also very long in the bank. She joined in 2009 as a senior environmental specialist, and I will now start to read things because I forget the rest of the stuff. Dr. Sieghart worked across different regions of the World Bank, including MENA and South Asia. She's deeply engaged in climate change issues with client countries to identify and address their climate change vulnerabilities. Prior to joining the bank, Dr. Sieghart worked at the German Development Agency, GIZ, and CIM. And don't ask me what CIM is, I don't know it. And UNIDO, the United Nations Industrial Development Organization, delivering climate change programs across the globe. Dr. Sieghart has authored and published a wide range of climate change-related articles and journals. She holds a PhD and a master's degree from the University of Salzburg in Austria and the University of Queensland in Australia in environmental sciences. Dr. Lia.
So good evening, everybody, and thank you so much for the kind introduction. And also, it's really a pleasure to be in Kuwait and to be back in Kuwait, and thanking KFAS for the kind hospitality to have us today. Allow me to also introduce my colleagues. Dr. Helena Naber, she is a senior environmental specialist. She's also the Regional Climate Change Coordinator for the Middle East and North Africa region, and she's based in Washington, D.C., so I'm glad she joined us here today. And then Dr. Lamia Mansour, also a senior environmental specialist, and who is joining us from our office in Beirut. So it's really a great pleasure and opportunity to talk to you today about and being invited to talk about climate change. So again, thank you so much for having us. So every year, 4 climate science institutions compile data from around 1,000 stations across the world. And while you see nuances on temperature, and while you see nuances in the data, and it's basically results back as to how data is being analyzed. But what we can say, the temperature has been rapidly warming, and particularly over the last 4 decades, and with the last decade seeing the highest temperature on record. And under the Paris Agreement, which also Kuwait is a party to, the parties committed to limiting the rise of global temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius, and which requires really very rapid and very decisive and bold actions from all parties involved. And what we see today is that global warming of 1.5 degrees Celsius will pose very significant risks to health, to livelihoods, to food security, water availability, human security, and economic growth. And if consequences of a 2-degree warmer world are expected to be far greater and exposing several hundred million of people more to climate-related risks. So increased urgency and leadership is really required in order to address climate change. And climate change is really an acute threat to global development, and it could push additional 100 million people into poverty within the next 10 years. And by 2050, more than 143 million people could become climate migrants, particularly moving from sub-Saharan Africa, moving from Latin America, and moving from South Asia. Not only uplifting people, but really all communities looking for less vulnerable places to live. And in that case, the Middle East and North Africa region is not an exception. And as you know, the Middle East and North Africa region is the region which is the most water scarce, food insecure, and energy subsidized region in the world. And the Middle East is highly vulnerable to natural and economic shocks. And 60%, as you are aware of, are living in areas which are acute underwater stress. The region is importing more food than it produces. And it's also 75% of the agriculture in the region is rain-fed, which means it's extremely vulnerable to changes in temperature and changes in precipitation. And climate change will really amplify the fragility by making it hotter, drier, poorer, and less inclusive. And what we can already see, particularly as temperatures are rising and towards 4 degrees Celsius, is that we are, particularly in the GCC, will be experiencing more heat waves, and there are estimates that cities, for example, like Riyadh, will by an increase of 40 degrees Celsius will experience 202 heat waves per year. And if temperatures are increasing by 4%, more than 6 months, the region will experience more than 6 months of droughts. And this means this will directly result in a reduction of crop production by 60%. And since the 1980s, we have seen extreme weather events, and these weather events have basically tripled over the last 20 years. We are seeing more of major flash floods, more heat waves, more droughts, in 3 times as we have seen 20 years before, and really impacting the lifespan of the people, the productivity, and the infrastructure across the region. And allow me to share with you some concrete examples that the region has been experiencing over the last 1 to 2 years, which sort of just to illustrate the vulnerability of the countries in the region. Just for example, just in 2018, Cyclone Meccano, which basically hit Djibouti, but on its way also had impact on Yemen and Oman, which cost 31 people lives and several billions losses in infrastructure. Or in 2018, on June 26th, Oman had seen temperature beyond 42 degrees Celsius for 24 hours. And then, of course, very close to home. Just 2 years ago, now the WMO has verified that Kuwait has seen the highest ever temperature recorded in Asia, and which the third highest temperature globally. So these are basically around 45 degrees Celsius. And as you have also outlined in your NDC, Kuwait is stressing its commitment to the international community in combating climate change, but also realizing that Kuwait is extremely exposed and vulnerable from the physical impacts of climate change, including the increase in temperature and heat extremes on one hand, and also sea level rise, in particular given that large parts of your economy are at the coastlines of the country. And what we can see is, particularly the Middle East and North Africa region, is facing a double jeopardy of risks. On one side, you have the physical and the societal impacts on climate change, on infrastructure, on ecosystems, on human health, but also on what we so-called the transition risks, that many nations across the globe are moving towards economies or decarbonization of economies, which would also have an impact on Kuwait. And what is really sort of moving forward, it's important to look at that adaptation, particularly adaptation to climate change, is essential to sustainable development of the countries. It's critical to look into early adaptation opportunities and to build the resilience for effectively avoiding damage. The longer one delays adaptation opportunities, the greater subsequent costs will the economies have to bear. It's also important, we had also a good discussion today with the colleagues from the Planning Commission. It's also important to include climate risk information into the planning processes of the country, and really also looking into location-specific vulnerability analysis to really understand what's happening on the ground and what are the and carry out cost-benefit analysis for proposed adaptation measures. An adaptation can deliver higher rates of return, and as you may know, the Global Commission on Adaptation, which was established in 2018 and is chaired by the UN Secretary General, by the Gates Foundation, as well as the World Bank, has just recently released a new report and looked into, which shows that investments on adaptation in the amount of $1.8 trillion over the next 5 years could yield benefits of $7 trillion in net benefits, and particularly in areas in investing in early warning systems, investing in climate resilient infrastructure, improved dryland agriculture. One of the critical areas, also particularly in the regions, is mangrove protection and resilience of water resources. And as I mentioned earlier, adaptation actions can generate triple dividends on looking into avoiding losses, the economic benefits, particularly by reducing risks and looking at how the adaptation of actions can lower financial costs, but also into addressing social and environmental benefits. And vulnerability in a climate change adaptation is based on basic elements. On one hand, to reduce and to prevent. This could include climate-proofing buildings and infrastructure, how to look into land use planning, but also nature-based solutions to protect people and assets. What just mentioned earlier, for example, utilizing mangrove forests for flood protection in certain areas, but also into looking into permanent relocation. But on the other side, what is also a key cornerstone is to prepare and also to respond in investing, what mentioned earlier, into early warning systems and forecast-based actions, strengthening first responders, and also looking into when it needs to be in temporary evacuation. And the third critical pillar is restore and recover, investing in insurance and risk finance instruments, in social safety nets, in building back better and building back stronger. But it's also very critical to understand that, and that's why it's a pleasure to have today so many representatives from many walks of life, from many institutions, from the civil societies, because addressing climate change really requires the involvement of multiple agencies, and it really requires a very strong interministerial coordination to address climate change. It requires, in the countries, it requires the involvement of the ministries of finance, of the ministries of planning, because it's in the end, it's also important to include it into the budget planning processes of the countries. And then, of course, the coordination with local governments is extremely important. And interagency committees may be necessary to help mainstream climate change initiatives into the plans of the various line ministries. What we have seen is, and what around the globe has been very helpful, is the development if countries develop climate change strategies and action plans, which really provide a framework for decision making. Many countries put climate change strategies and action plans forward with a horizon of 5 years, and with detailed actions, interventions, investments, policies, institutional reforms, and in order to meet intermediate targets which are normally put forward in such a climate change strategy and action plan. And really in this, the action plan is also critical to prioritize climate actions based on their impacts, but also the cost effectiveness, because you also don't want to over-invest. You really want to find ways to structure your investments in a way that they are addressing climate change in a phased manner, so that you don't overinvest in certain infrastructure, but also that the strategy is adaptive, because as science evolves, as the changing climate is evolving, that you really can look into how to adapt your climate change strategy in the years to come. Thank you so much for your attention, and we are very welcome. We would be very welcome your questions.
Thank you very much, Dr. Lia, for this enlightenment presentation. Just one point before we open the floor for Q&A. I'd like just you to highlight the carbon capture role in the prevention side of the adaptation plan. Is there a strong commitment toward carbon capture or carbon-free fossil fuel sources in the future? Is there any role for clean energy that might help in preventing such drastic changes? The second thing is, as you said, investment. You put 1.7 trillion and you get about 7 trillion plus in return. Is this as an investment or indirect benefits for societies? Because I always remember and recall the example of renewable energy. Technology-wise, renewable energy was very efficient and very mature since the 70s. And we always trying to market renewable as a good for environment, but it never kicked off until we managed to bring the cost of kilowatt hour in a competitive level comparing to conventional methods. Then governments and companies start investing in renewable energy technology, whether wind, or solar. And they are trying to use the environment as a reason, but we knew the main reason was the economics, not the because technology was mature a long time back. But once the price became competitive and below or competing with the conventional methods, then renewables start taking place, and very soon it will have a strong market share with respect to energy demand globally. So do we have a similar situation in carbon capture or adaptation for climate change? Once it became economically feasible, then it will start spreading widely, or we'll start digging for right policy to adapt the climate change plans.
Thank you for these very helpful comments. And we are very often get the questions on CCS, carbon capture and storage. What we see is there are a couple of activities happening, particularly at the R&D stage. There is still a lot of discussion on the countries in terms of upfront costs, but it has also now been included in Article 6 at the latest negotiations. So what we are seeing now is also that there is sort of an interest from the countries, but also to find ways how to finance these infrastructures, particularly with emission credits. And as you know, the prices at this stage are very low, and that's why the bank has put in place what is called a storage facility, where people can put their emission credits forward, which then could be traded and shared at the global markets, which could be a solution to unleash the opportunities of CCS. Any thoughts? Any additional ones? Okay. And on the, perhaps Elena, do you want to take the second question on the 1.7 trillion and indirect benefits?
Yes. Yes, so basically this is a calculation from the report that looked at how much, if there is investment of 1.7 trillion in 5 areas between 2020 to 2030, how much would be the return? And it is not, of course, it takes into account the social cost also of the, basically it's, yeah, the social cost as well. So basically the benefits.
Honestly, I have 3 point of views that it came to my mind. Is the first one is related to the adaptation techniques or the adaptation approach. Lately, there are talks about adaptation mitigation approach. And honestly, I don't see much of a difference between what you presented as an adaptation and the adaptation mitigation approach. I would like you to shed some light on this one. The second thing is what related to our region, the MENA region. As you know, the target is a 25 degree, correct me if I'm wrong, as an average temperature that we are basing on. To the best of my information, the average temperature in this region is never close to the 20s or 30s. What do you think of advancing into the argument of we need to raise, in order to be more practical in terms of policy formation, to a much higher baseline other than the 25 degree that everyone is been mentioning all the time? That's the third thing. I would like to hear from you. What do you think of the new initiative raised by the Secretary General, which will be raised on the Climate Change Summit on the coming meeting in New York? I went through these initiatives. It seemed that the Secretary General gave up that the Paris Agreement is actually being active enough to be enforced or to be really taken seriously by countries. Again, our stand is very clear. There are countries which carry the burden of the emission of the GHG more than any other countries, especially if we are talking about the 2 largest economies in the world. Now, these initiatives, if you had the chance to look at them, Do you expect this initiative can have an impact on the target of the climate change baseline, which is going back to the 25, maybe, I don't know, 25 degree, or better? I mean, to us, is 30 degree or 40 degree will be more reasonable in our region. As I said, you gave a very condensed, concentrated, depressing presentation that it get me into a lot of a question, but I will be satisfied with these three comments. Thank you.
No, thank you. Thank you for these questions. I mean, in terms of the outlook, I mean, it's on the one hand, but one also needs to see it's also quite encouraging that really countries have put forward their NDCs and really taking their NDCs very serious. And Kuwait is of course, one of those countries in having put forward its mitigation activities as well as on the adaptation side. And I understand also Kuwait has just finalized its NAP. So there are many activities happening and the countries are taking steps to address climate change. And I think that's sort of on the bright side, that people are really, countries are really stepping up. And it has come out, it says the dialogue on climate change has really morphed out of I remember when I started working on climate change 15, 20 years ago, it was really something that would be sitting in the ministries of environment in one department, which was maybe manned by 1-2 people. But now it's really something where all the line ministers, in most of the countries, all the line ministries are coming together. You see representatives from the Ministry of Planning, from the Ministry of Finance, from the Ministry of Energy. In your case also KPC, where really people are and institutions are getting together, are on the one side to find solutions how to reduce GHG emissions on one hand, but also find ways to adapt to climate change. And I think very often, particularly, and I've been working in the GCC countries for quite some time, and that's why I wanted to, I took a very conscious decision today not to talk too much on the mitigation side, because being an oil producing country, very often get into these discussions. But on the other hand, we also need to see that Kuwait is a very low emitter in GHG emissions, but is also extremely vulnerable to climate change. So I think that's why it was, although it may be depressing on one side, but I wanted to really also highlight the vulnerability of the country. Because very often, particularly when you see oil-producing countries, the discussion always drifts on the mitigation side, drifts how to reduce GHG emissions. But given that you're vulnerable to sea level rise, the high temperature, as you have rightly pointed out, and we have seen that Kuwait has been on record as having the in Asia the highest temperature on record since the data was collected. You raise also a very interesting point on this. I refer to it a little bit as two sides of a coin. On the one hand, you have the mitigation side, and on the other, the adaptation side. So it's I like to use, it's just a simple example, but I like to use, for example, afforestation and reforestation efforts. Could be mangrove plantations, because on one side it's really helping to protect infrastructures, and we have seen where, particularly in regions which are highly prone to cyclones, that these have really buffered the impacts on the physical infrastructure on the land. But on the other hand, those are also carbon sinks. So you always have mitigation and adaptation. Adaptation lies linked, and something that we commonly refer to climate co-benefits. And from the World Bank side, we have taken a very strong stance, particularly on addressing climate change, and we have mandatory targets that all our programs have to 30% of all our lending has to address climate change, which are mandatory targets, which we are which are being measured across our programs. And that's something where we also see now is that, particularly on the mitigation side, we see that in many countries it's something also where the private sector is stepping in, but where the area that has more and more lagged is on the adaptation side, and that's something, that's why our target is now increasing, going more onto the adaptation side, which is, because we see that's something where countries really need help. Helena, you want to add something, or Lamia?
Yeah, just to add up on the impact of climate change in our region. It's not only it has become very visible, but at every policy level, like dialogues on water, energy, food nexus, is always bringing up the issues of food security and water security, which has major weaknesses for our region, and the impact of climate change on this issue, and the need to ensure intersectoral coordination in order to face this major impact on our economy, on our health, on our livelihood, has become common practice, has become is very clear to everybody.
With regard to climate change, there's some pluses also you might want to think about. Mm-hmm. You just mentioned water and food. If you're going to melt some of this ice, you can have much more fresh water than exists now. With more CO2 in the atmosphere, you can have more food grow. More plants will be growing. Greenland now is very happy because they can plant their own vegetables. Mm-hmm. And then you've got the micro and macro aspects. A person who smokes, say, 2 packs of cigarettes, if you upscale him, he produces more pollutants than a 500 megawatt electricity plant. So until humanity gives up on cigarettes, I think I'm not going to get excited.
So for opportunities to address climate change, I think this is one of the things that now the new global report that was issued by the Global Commission comes to, that there are opportunities. There are becoming more opportunities as the technology is changing and as the policies in the different countries are changing as well. So it's becoming one of the things that I think you mentioned is on renewable energy. But one of the things that has encouraged new renewable energy is, on one side, technology, but on the other side, it's also the changes in policies to make it the decrease also in the increase in the prices, but also the changes in the policy. So it's also always important, and like you have mentioned, to have the different elements that come together to create these different opportunities.
And I would still not encourage to smoke 2 packs of cigarettes a day.
Well, that's the thing, because people live in different places, so maybe it's better for Greenland, but it will be much worse for other places. And like Lia mentioned, so some of the cities will simply become quite hot, and there will be a need to adapt, of course, but some of it will be basically behavioral adaptation and putting in protective things and changing the behavior. So one of the things that we saw, for example, then when the temperature is too hot here in Kuwait, that there are usually announcements that the work hours are shifting. And this is something that will be becoming more common.
Yeah. My question is, do you use the same environmental indicators, the one which was set up by the IPCC, or you have your environmental indicators?
No, the same.
Second thing is that if you have your environmental indicators, do you have the same environmental indicators for all the countries, or each country has its own environmental indicators? Thank you.
Lamia, you want to?
Actually, the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change has established a very rigorous system with IPCC, a very rigorous system for reporting and monitoring of climate change. And all the countries have been reporting regularly. We learned that Kuwait has submitted their second national communication to the UNFCCC. Yeah, there is a very good value added in being able to compare globally the changes, like the progress that is made by countries in terms of emissions, in terms of mitigation action, and in terms of adaptation. And the other systematic report was the NDC, which was presented initially for the Paris Agreement, and all the countries has also set their plans for mitigation and adaptation, and taking it from there. You want to add something?
No, I mean, only just two points. What is also important to see is that adaptation actions are extremely site-specific. So what works maybe in Europe, and I'm from Austria, may not work here. What works here may not work somewhere else. So I think that's very critical, and that's why something like a climate change strategy and action plan, which is really looking at site-specific actions, and that worked. I mean, it's not. Very often it's also not new, it's not new technologies, because the way, for example, houses here were built in Kuwait over a long time span were almost built in with national air conditioning. So it's really looking at very site-specific activities. And in terms of the methodologies on the mitigation side, what we have agreed upon methodologies which we share on mitigation co-benefits, which we share with the various MDBs, to really see that we have a standardized approach, how we monitorize climate actions, and that this is not different from here to other countries. So that's something we also are obliged and have committed to report on. Sir.
Yeah, thank you very much, Lia, for the enlightening presentation. I'm very glad your presentation focused on adaptation, because I was involved in the early stages of negotiation of the climate change convention, and adaptation was very much on the table, okay, as a very viable option to deal with climate change. Unfortunately, as negotiations progressed from Kyoto onward, okay, the focus was on mitigation more than other options, okay, especially on the energy side, where the mitigation focuses on energy transition and reducing fossil fuel consumption, but adaptation somehow was put back in the back burner. Mm-hmm. So I'm glad now adaptation is coming back as one of the viable options as a policy option for climate change. And I think still remains, adaptation remains one of the options available to policymakers, along with mitigation, to address climate change consequences. Okay, and it would be good, I think, to somehow try to give the pros and cons of each policy options, adaptation, and mitigation. Just for the policymakers to, decide which would be the best option to climate change. Could be one, could be two, whatever. Mm-hmm. The other thing, as you just mentioned a while ago, it's very site-specific, and I wish the World Bank could work with countries like Kuwait, okay, which I would try to think of what type of adaptation measures we can implement for climate, for a country like Kuwait with the desert climate and very hot climate like what we have, or the GCC countries. What type of adaptation that you think would be suitable for a country like Kuwait or the countries of the Gulf compared to adaptation measures for Europe and other locations? Thank you.
First of all, thanks a lot for the interventions. Again, on what just on sort of on top of my mind, it's really looking at what could be vulnerable measures. But basically, as I said, it's sort of mitigation and adaptation is really two sides of the same coin. But looking into, for example, building codes, what we discussed today on healthy smart cities could be an option. Then also water recycling schemes, looking into protection of wetlands, mangrove plantations. So there are a lot of elements. But again, one needs to look into what is site-specific, to have a very proper cost-benefit analysis done, and also to see that one does not over-invest in certain physical infrastructure, because there are also a number of what we call nature-based solutions that also can offset some of the costs. Because what we often see is that countries invest in physical infrastructure in order to prepare for a sea level rise of 1, 2, whatever meters. But what doesn't need to be done immediately. One can really, see how to increase your adaptation efforts over time to see what is really needed over the next couple of years, and then adapt along the way. So coming up with adaptation strategies which really are, in a way, prepare the countries for the years to come without necessarily heavily investing in heavy infrastructure that may not be needed at this moment in time. You want to add something,
Yes,
Lamia?
if I can add something, because we haven't really here spoke about the local benefits. So we spoke about the mitigation benefits and then the adaptation benefits that have some mitigation. But there are a lot of also adaptation or mitigation measures that have actually local benefits. One of these, for example, some of the resource efficiency, energy efficiency measures, they also have benefits to reducing air pollution and reducing solid waste, reducing use of water resources. And these are all benefits that will have basically benefit the local environment. The other thing also is to have to have a very long-term view as well of something, especially when planning for the infrastructure, because any plan or any infrastructure that is put in place today will be there operational for 25, for 50, for more years, and that kind of locks the country into the carbon growth path that it does. So basically, it's important to also take these things into account.
Maybe I can give an example from Lebanon, because we are also suffering from climate change, and we have cedar forests that are like the emblem of our country, which are affected by climate change. So the impact is at two levels. First, the increase of temperature is increasing possibility of infestation by some parasites, because the lack of frost is increasing these parasites, and the migration of the species, because the cedar tree can only grow between like 1,200 and 1,800, and then beyond this and below this, they cannot grow. But so now what we see is a migration upwards of the species. So where they can go higher, they will grow. If the mountain will stop at 1,800, they will just not be able to grow any further. And for the infestation of specific parasites, there are extensive efforts to look at natural ways to address them, and so far they have succeeded. And looking at again at the socioeconomic benefit, this is an ecotourism revenue and a livelihood. It has livelihood importance of keeping the rural areas alive. So it's cultural, it's site-specific, and it also has its value that needs to be taken into account.
During the 60s and 70s, Kuwait have a very dense vegetation cover. I'm not sure if the climate change contribute to distinct natural species or vice versa, because the drought and the distinct of the natural species, the temperature get rise. But nowadays, the desert in Kuwait converted to plain desert without any vegetation cover. We used to live without air conditioning. Then in the 70s, we start putting air conditioning. We turn it on from 10 o'clock till 4 o'clock, then we turn it off. Then we continue the rest of the day with a small fan. It works. Nowadays, it is 24 hour. Home, malls, offices, government building, it's 24 hour air conditioned. It consumes more than 70% of our electricity production during June, July, August, and even September. Whatever we generate from power plants based on fossil fuel goes for electrifying the air conditioning systems. Do you consider, and planting the native species, we have more than 65 plants, different species, native species in Kuwait. Most of them now being grown in greenhouses, and people start selling them as a kind of greening the house gardens. Their benefit, they get green during summer. If you go to the desert in Kuwait and you find the remaining of these species, you find them getting green from June, July, August, then they get dry as the winter came. So they are the right plants suitable for desert. The last amount of water they get during the late spring season, probably if they are lucky get rain during March or April, and that's it. By mid of summer they start growing, and this is how they been built. So if a national campaign to replant, because the technique we knew it, Kuwait Institute for Scientific Research participated heavily to plant and replant these native species. We have seed banks in Kuwait for these plants. So do you think it will be a good measure or mitigation measure to replant the Kuwaiti desert? This might contribute to reduce the temperature. This is from local experience that we witnessed over the last few decades. The concern now regarding to the air conditioning, the last 2 summers, the highest sale of air conditioning equipments happening in the Southern Europe, which means in the same line, we are moving north. So as the heat or temperature goes north, the region here will get higher. We exceeded 50 degrees. It became almost normal. We are not surprised anymore if we see the 50s like 1 decade back. So this is just to contribute on the same line as Dr. Mohammed said.
I mean, I'm just flying out from here to Beirut, but then I'm flying out to South Korea. I mean, which is of course heavily urbanized, but what has also helped, and this is along your lines, is really on the plantations of green belts, which on one side helps to reduce the heat island effects we see in many of the countries, particularly in the Gulf, and also one added benefit is also to help with the dust storms, cause a sort of buffer zones. So certainly that would be an extremely important initiative to look into and see, to find ways for afforestation or reforestation or replanting efforts. Yeah, exactly.
Just one note. I think the problem, there is a big gap between the scientists and the policymakers.
Mm-hmm.
A big gap. Like the IPCC reports,
Mm-hmm.
the policymakers, the politicians mostly, they don't understand what's written there in the reports.
Mm-hmm.
Because the scientists wrote their reports in their way, in their scientific way. Numbers, values, tables, graphs. But the policymakers, do not really understand what's going on there.
Yeah.
So I think that the scientists have to go a little bit down and to write their reports to be, easy to read, to understand by the policymakers.
Mhm.
Otherwise, there will be a big gap between the two parties.
In order to address also
Yeah.
coming up with valuable strategies and policies. Mm-hmm. Sorry, there was in the back.
Thank you for that very insightful talk. On that note, that there is a gap between the policymakers and the scientists, can we take it one level further in understanding about climate education? What is the push for educating the youth, especially in the secondary and high school, about climate change? Because they are the next generation of advocacy makers, the next generation of policymakers. So how are we incorporating the knowledge of this into the education systems around the world?
No, I think that's a very critical point, and perhaps I should not say this officially, so offline. I mean, I really applaud the climate strikes that we see. This youth movements. Again, offline. Kasam has not heard me now.
We won't tell her daughter either.
No, I think, and that's exactly it. I think it's becoming so loud nowadays, and there is this really big movement. And I think as you see, schools are closing down. We just saw yesterday there was an announcement, for example, that New York City has provided an announcement that if kids walk out of schools on these Fridays, they will be excused. So I think it is something that really needs to be in the core curriculums of the schools, of primary education, secondary education. But I think there is much more understanding from the younger populations, and there is really a strong push in the right directions. So I think there is no longer we just don't any longer have the luxury to wait. I mean, as you rightly have pointed out, just now in Europe, I mean, my family for the first time has bought air conditioning because we're used to setting up the heating systems. So I mean, I think this is just we need to act now. There is simply no time left, and I think with Kuwait having put forward its NDCs and put forward the NAP, this is the right direction. And now it's really in looking into what are the policy measures, how do you include it in your strategic planning processes, what are the line ministries doing in the various in their various areas, in order really to. And also the budget processes. I mean, it needs to be also aligned with budget processes in order to being able to implement various activities. And I think this is exactly the right direction to move forward.
I want to just raise one issue with regard to the gap between the policy making and the scientific evidence. Mm-hmm. We moved recently to evidence-based policy. Mm-hmm. And today we discussed mm-hmm. the policy set that we have, and I think they are very well aligned mm-hmm. very much so. With all the scientific evidence we have. The real issue is not the policy gap. The real issue is the buy-in. During implementation, the policy owner, from a strategic perspective, should be equipped with the enough knowledge capacity, whether institutional or individual, to understand how this policy, which is an evidence-based policy, to be implemented. Now, this is on one side. The second main issue is the urgency, which you already mentioned. If the implementer or the policy owner, they do not have the urgency to take initiatives and action to do it, this is the real gap. Moving them, as Dr. Leila said, moving them from comfort zone. It is the comfort zone that we are trapped in. It's like a rabbit hole that we need to move from. And I see this not just in the MENA region. I saw it also in Europe as well. And I saw it also in South Asia. And even, I mean, in the United States it's quite obvious. And even in South America. It is not about the evidence-based policy made. It is the urgency to carry out the change.
Yeah. I mean, I think in terms of there is I don't think there is one single country where there is the lack of information that prevents anybody to implement activities. I mean, this argument may have been valid 10 years ago, but this is no longer valid. As Lamia has pointed out, you have finalized the second national communication, the NDC, the NAP. So there is enough, and of course, I mean, the IPCC reports are there. Kuwait has done its own assessments. The bank established for each and every country adaptation profiles. It's no longer a matter of saying we don't have enough evidence to act. And it's really about implementing, but also to ensure there is accountability. And I think that's something where it needs to be really matched with, and in terms of finding ways to having, as you said, evidence-based policies, but also to ensure there is accountability and people are being held accountable to what they have put forward in their national strategies.
Good evening. Thank you for the presentation. What I noticed and what I want to ask, the $1.7 trillion need to be invested for the climate change is globally. The World Bank and the other institutions, are they make some structure for how to finance this $1.7 trillion in globally? Is there any structure for this finance? And actually, based on your answer, I would like to add my comments, if you don't mind.
Yes. So the cycles, I'm not really sure. Well, basically, this is some of the things that are looked in the reports. But it seems that it seems that it's a trend up. It's an upward trend rather than a cycle up and down. So I don't know if you remember, there was the very first slide that very clearly showed an upward trend, and so at least in our visible, realistic lifetimes of the future generations. Now, what will happen million years? It's difficult to say, but yes. So that's on the cycles, and on the 1.7 trillions on the. Yes, yes. Yeah. And there are also other graphs, if I remember the reports, that show the extremes. And then it's very clearly, we don't have it here in this presentation, but it's also in the climate reports. I don't know if you have seen it. But it very clearly shows, and you see it very clearly, I think it's the past 200 years, where it starts from the blue and then it starts red, red, red. I think it's the number of maximum temperatures global, and you can very clearly see it going up. So at least not in the past 200 years.
And in terms of the investment and in terms of the bank's mandate, and that's one of from the World Bank's from our side, it's what we call a corporate commitment. So 30% of all our financing needs to address climate change. So that's a target we have to achieve. And we also particularly put forward that 50% need to go to adaptation finance. So we have a very, very hard target, which we are being held accountable also by our board, and something that we have really ingrained in our activities across the globe.
Sorry, my question is how we are going to find the source of this $1.37 billion? I mean, who is going to supply this money? Who will pay? Mm-hmm. Is it global wise? Mm-hmm. Who is going to take a share of this investment? Mm-hmm. Because and this climate change is basically on the developed countries, industrialized countries. So what is your perspective on this investment to share between the countries?
Yeah, so some of these investments, I will have to go more deeply into the study to be able to really point out where the 1.7 does. But basically, this is a study that looks at what globally can be invested. So the investments will be at the level of the countries. And it's not necessarily, this is not only in the developing countries, this is basically at the global level. And what it shows is that there is, if a country would invest, if basically at the global level we invest in these 5 areas, then there will be very high return in terms of the social benefit, net social benefit. I don't think it answers your question, because I think what you are asking is whether the World Bank has 1.7 trillion or a fund, but I don't think that, yeah. So I cannot answer your question on that. I don't know if my colleagues can, but.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for having us. No, thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Really a pleasure. Good, thank you. How about you?
Excellent.
Can you move the other side? We can take a small picture. Let's take a group picture. Thank you so much.